My name is Dorothea Vance, and I am 81 years old, and I am recording this in the kitchen of the house my husband built with his own hands in the fall of 1951, before the survey work took him away for good. I want to say that plainly at the start, because what I am about to describe will sound, to many ears, like the testimony of a woman whose grief unhinged her, and I need you to understand, before I say another word, that I am not that woman. I was a registered nurse for 34 years. I delivered 207 babies in this valley and the ones surrounding it. I have set broken bones by lantern light, and I have read a government death certificate and understood exactly what the language meant and what it was choosing not to say. I know the difference between what I wish were true and what I observed. I have known that difference my entire adult life, and I am holding it carefully even now, even at the end of things, even sitting here with the recorder running and the kitchen going dark around me. Gus has been gone from this world for 6 years. The last of the others who knew the truth, a man named Willard Foss, who trapped the Upper Goat Range for 40 years and never told a single soul what he witnessed, died in the spring, and his dying was the thing that loosened the knot in my chest. Willard and I made a promise to each other in the winter of 1974, sitting in this same kitchen, that we would carry what we knew until neither of us was left to carry it. He kept his half. I intend to keep mine. This is what I am telling the recorder, for whoever finds it, for my granddaughter Petra most of all, because Petra has her grandfather's eyes, and she has asked me twice in the last year whether the stories about her grandfather are true, and I cannot lie to her face the way I have lied to every official document that ever crossed this table. My husband's name was Gordon Vance. He was 43 years old in the summer of 1958, when he walked into the Kootenays range on a government survey contract and did not come back. He was 5'11", lean in the way that men who work outdoors get lean after 40, with brown hair going grey at the sides and hands that were large and careful. He had worked for the provincial lands branch for 16 years at that point, and he was the kind of surveyor who trusted what he measured and distrusted everything he could not. He was not a man given to imagination. That is the important thing to say about Gordon Vance. He was not a man who embroidered. When he told you something, you could take it to the bank in Creston, and it would clear. He left on the 14th of June. I remember the morning exactly. The light coming flat and yellow through the kitchen window, the coffee on the stove, his pack frame leaning against the door with the canvas straps already buckled. Our son Thomas was 7 years old that summer, and he was still asleep, and Gordon went to the door of Thomas's room and looked in for a long time. Without going in, the way a man looks at something, he is quietly measuring against all his other measurements. Then he came back to the kitchen and poured the rest of his coffee down the drain and set the cup upside down on the drainer, which was a habit of his I had always found irritating, and which I have never found irritating since. He said the survey would take 4 weeks. He said the upper drainage of the Goat River was dense going, and he might be a few days longer. He kissed me in a way that was ordinary and unhurried. He walked out the door. That was the last time I saw him with my own eyes, standing upright in the light. The search went on for 11 days in July. The provincial police came, and the lands branch sent 2 other surveyors who knew the terrain, and Willard Foss went with them, because Willard knew that country better than any man alive. They found Gordon's second camp set on a bench above the Goat River, where the ground was level, and the timber opened enough for instrument work, and the camp was orderly in the way that Gordon's camps were always orderly. The cook kit hung from the proper branch, the food cache strung at the right height, the sleeping roll lashed and leaned against the pack frame, as he always left it when he was working during the day. It was the orderliness that the constable mentioned to me when he came to the house in July, and the orderliness was what Gordon's fellow surveyors found most difficult to account for, because a man who fled into the bush in fear or in confusion does not leave a tidy camp behind him. They found his transit instrument, still set up on its tripod, aimed at a sight line he had been marking. They found his field notebook, open to a page of measurements in his careful small hand, the last entry dated the 22nd of June. They did not find Gordon. They found no sign of injury. They found no indication of a fall, no blood, no disturbance in the earth that would suggest a struggle. They found a pair of boot prints in the soft mud along the Goat River bank, Gordon's size, and they found where those prints stopped. And they found, beside those prints, in the same soft mud, a set of prints that none of the search party could account for. They were large. I did not learn the precise dimensions until Willard told me years later. 17 inches in length, 8 across the ball of the foot, pressed deep as the prints of a very heavy man or something heavier still. Willard Foss stood over those second prints for a long time, the police constable told me later. He said, Willard looked at them the way a man looks at something he has been half expecting and is not entirely relieved to see. The constable asked Willard what made them. Willard said he did not know. The constable wrote this down in his notebook, and then the search moved on. And the prints were not mentioned again in any official report I was ever shown. The constable who came to my door was a careful man, a decent man, and he told me everything the search had found, and he told me the finding of the prints in a steady, quiet voice, and then he said, in a voice of the same steadiness, that the prints were being attributed in the official record to an unspecified large animal, and that this was what the record would say, and that he wanted me to know what he was attributing them to, and also what he was not in a position to attribute them to. And I thanked him for the distinction, and he nodded, and he drove back down the lane, and I never spoke to him again. The Lands Branch declared Gordon Vance missing in August of 1958. The coroner's office issued a presumptive death certificate in the spring of 1960, which was the earliest they could under the provincial statutes. I filed the paperwork they required. I answered the questions they asked. Thomas and I continued to live in this house, on my nursing wages and on the small pension the Lands Branch provided for the widow of a man presumed dead in service. I told Thomas his father had been lost in the mountains. This was true. It was not the whole truth. I did not know the whole truth yet. I went back to work at the clinic in September, and I worked steadily, and I was good at my work, and my colleagues treated me with the particular careful gentleness that people extend to the newly bereaved, and I received the gentleness and said, "Thank you," and went home each evening and sat at this table and thought about Gordon's boot prints ending in the mud beside the Goat River, and about what the constable's face had looked like when he described the other prints, and I held those two things together without resolution, because resolution was not available to me yet. The first letter came in October of 1958. I want to be precise about this. It was the 9th of October, a Thursday, because I was not working that day and I had spent the morning splitting kindling for the cold that was already coming down off the range. I walked out to the mailbox at the end of the lane, and there was an envelope with no stamp and no postmark, and my name written on the front in Gordon, Eyre handwriting, not resembling Gordon's handwriting, not approximately, exactly. The capital D of Dorothea, which he always made with a particular slight backward lean. The period after Mrs. placed just so. I stood at the end of the lane for a long time. My hands were not steady, and I was not ashamed of that. I brought the envelope inside, and I sat at this table and I opened it. It was 3 pages. I have read those 3 pages so many times that I no longer need to read them. They are installed in me, the way certain psalms are installed, in people who grew up saying them in the dark. He said he was alive. He said he was not injured. He said he was somewhere he could not describe in terms that would be useful to a search party, and that any attempt to find him along the route they had been searching would not succeed. He said I should not wait for him. He said he meant that in the practical sense, not in the emotional sense, and the distinction was one only Gordon Vance would have thought to make in a letter of that kind. And it was the distinction that convinced me, more than the handwriting, more than the paper, that I was reading words my husband had written. He said Thomas should be told he was alive, when Thomas was old enough to understand what the telling would mean. He said he was sorry for the fear, and that he had not chosen this in the ordinary sense of choosing, and that the word choice was perhaps not quite right, but that he lacked a better word. He said he thought he would be able to write again. He closed with the phrase he always used at the end of letters. Your G. I sat with those pages for a long time. It was dark by the time I moved from the table. I made supper for Thomas. I put him to bed. I came back to the table and I read the letter again. Then I put it in the tin I used for important documents, behind the plates in the high cupboard, and I went to bed, and I did not sleep. I want to be clear about what I believed and what I did not believe in the months that followed. I did not believe Gordon had walked away from his life deliberately. I knew that man. He would not have done it. I did not believe the letter was a forgery, because no one who knew Gordon's handwriting well enough to forge it had any motive I could identify, and because the letter contained 3 specific private references to a conversation we had had the previous February, to a small scar on my left wrist that I have never explained to anyone, and to the name we had agreed on for the child we lost in 1954, which we had never told a single person, that no forger could have known. I believed the letter was real. What I did not yet believe, or did not yet understand how to believe, was what the letter was describing. I held those facts in 2 separate hands for a long time. Gordon wrote this. What Gordon is describing, I do not yet understand. The second letter came in March of 1959, the third in October of the same year. They came twice a year after that, spring and fall, without fail. 11 years, 22 letters in total. The last one arrived in the spring of 1969, and after that the letters stopped. And by then I understood why they had stopped, though the understanding did not make it easier to receive no more of them. He told me things in those letters. I am going to say this carefully, because I spent a very long time thinking about how to say it. And the way you say a thing like this determines whether it is received as the truth of a serious person or the fantasy of a grieving one. He described where he was. He described it with the precision of a man who had been trained his entire working life to observe and record what was in front of him, not what he wished were in front of him. He described a territory in the upper goat drainage that he had not seen on any provincial map, a high valley behind what he called the second wall of the range, accessible only through a particular narrow passage in the rock that was easy to miss and difficult to navigate from the survey side of the drainage. He gave compass headings. He described the timber, the rock formations, the quality of the water. He described the aspect of the valley in different seasons with the same flat accuracy he would have used in a field report. The direction the first light came from in July, the behavior of the snow on the north-facing slopes, the particular quality of the drainage in spring, when the high snowpack came off the peaks all at once, and the valley floor held it briefly before recing it south. He described the animals, which were the animals of that country. Mountain goat on the upper faces, deer in the valley floor, grouse everywhere, the same populations any careful observer would have noted. And he described, with the same flatness, what he called the others who shared the valley, and he used that word consistently across all 22 letters, the others, and he never exchanged it for any other word, not because he lacked imagination, but because the word was accurate, and he was a man for whom accuracy was the first obligation. He wrote about them the way he wrote about the water and the timber, as facts of the landscape, things he had measured and recorded and come to understand through long observation. By the third year of letters, he wrote about them the way you write about the specific details of a place you know well, with the small asides and particular observations of a man who has learned something by being present to it for a long time. I am not going to describe in detail everything he wrote about the others, because some of it is not mine to tell, and because some of it Gordon himself said he could not translate into words that would hold the thing steadily. What I will say is what I observed, which is distinct from what I was told. I am a nurse. What I observed, I am prepared to stand behind. What Gordon told me, I received as the testimony of a reliable witness, and I weighted it accordingly. Willard Foss came to me in the spring of 1961. He had heard, through the Valley's particular network of practical people, that I had received correspondence from my dead husband, and he had come to see whether I was well and whether I needed anything, and those were not the real reasons he came. He was a tall man, Willard, with a face that had been weathered to something close to the texture of the bark on a lodgepole pine, and he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who has spent decades in country that rewards patience and punishes haste. He knocked at the door on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and he removed his hat when I answered. And he said that he had been meaning to come by for some time, and that he hoped he was not imposing, and I could see in his face that he had been building toward this visit for considerably longer than he was admitting. I brought him in and poured coffee, and we sat at this table, which is the table where every important conversation in this house has taken place. He sat with both hands wrapped around his cup, and he looked at the surface of the table for a long time, and I did not try to fill the silence, because I recognized it as a working silence. The silence of a man composing something he had been composing for a while, and needed to finish before he could speak it. He drank 2 cups of coffee, and then a third, and I refilled the pot, and we sat some more, and the afternoon light moved across the table in the way it does in April, when the angle is still low, and then he put his third cup down, and looked at the table and said that He had seen something in the summer of 1954, before Gordon disappeared, in the upper goat drainage, and that he had not told anyone because he had not known what to do with what he had seen, and that, if I was receiving letters from Gordon, he thought perhaps he should tell me now. Willard Foss was not a fanciful man. He was 61 years old in 1961, and he had trapped and guided in the Kootenays for 35 years, and he had the kind of steady, horizontal seriousness of a man who has spent decades alone in country that will kill you if you are careless or dishonest about what you see. He told me what he had seen in 1954. He described it for 20 minutes in the same flat, steady voice he would have used to describe a bear crossing a draw or a change in the weather. He described the hour, which was dusk, and the location, which was the north face of the second bench, above the Goat River, and the duration of the sighting, which was, by his estimate, somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes, before the thing moved back into the timber. He described what he saw with the care of a man who had been waiting 7 years for someone to give him permission to describe it. He described the height which he estimated against the timber around it. He described the colour of the fur, which was very dark brown, almost black in the low light, and the breadth of the shoulders, and the way it moved, which was deliberate and unfrightened, not the explosive movement of a surprised animal, but the measured movement of something going where it intended to go at the pace it chose. He described the moment it became aware of him. It stopped moving, and it turned, and it regarded him for, perhaps, 4 of those 8 to 12 minutes, looking at him in the same flat, assessing way that he was looking at it, and then it continued on its way, and Willard stayed where he was until the timber had closed completely behind it, and then he turned and went back to his camp and sat by his fire for a long time before he slept. When he was done, I went to the high cupboard and I took down the tin. I let him read 5 of Gordon's letters, selected for the ones that contained the most specific observations about the valley and the others. He read slowly. He was a long time reading. When he put the last letter down, he sat with his hands flat on the table and said, in a voice I can still hear, that he thought Gordon was probably all right. He said, "I think that country is safe for him," I said. "Why?" he said. "Because of what they are. Not what people say they are, what they actually are." That was all he said. It was enough. He drank one more cup of coffee, and he put his hat back on, and he walked to his truck, and before he opened the door, he turned and said that he would like to come back sometime, if that was agreeable to me. And I said it was, and he came back 9 or 10 times over the following years, always when he had something specific to say, never out of social habit alone. And each time he left, I felt more steadily held inside what I knew, which was, I have come to understand exactly what he intended. Willard and I did not speak of it often after that. 3 or 4 times in the years that followed, one of us would come to the other's kitchen with a particular set of the face, and we would sit and say a few sentences and then not say anything else, and that was how we managed it between us. He never told his wife, Eloise, who was a perfectly good woman, and who died in 1967 of a heart condition she had carried since girlhood, and who, in all the years of her marriage to Willard, never once pressed him about the things he brought back from the upper country. He never told his son Bernard, who took over part of the trap line after Willard got too old for the high country, and who knew the goat drainage well, and who has, to my knowledge, never seen anything there that he could not account for. which is perhaps a matter of where a man directs his attention when he is moving through a particular stretch of timber. I never told my sister Catherine in Kamloops, who would have worried herself sick, and who would have told the story to at least 4 other people. Within a week of hearing it, not out of malice, but out of the kind of social generosity that has no sense of which things are meant to travel, and which are meant to stay. We told Thomas together, in the winter of 1970, when Thomas was 19, and had been asking questions for 2 years with increasing precision. Thomas takes after his father in the way that sometimes skips a generation and doubles down. The same lean, careful attention, the same disposition to trust observation over interpretation, the same quality of looking at a problem from all sides, before he says what he thinks about it. He was 19, but he had the face of a man considerably older when we sat him at this table and laid the letters out, and Willard spoke, first because I asked him to, and then I spoke. Thomas took it the way his father would have taken it. He sat still for a long time, and then he asked 3 or 4 careful questions, which were questions about the chronology and the physical evidence, not about what it meant or what we should do with it, because Thomas understood instinctively, as Gordon had understood in those first letters, that what it meant was a separate inquiry from what had happened and needed to be approached in its own time. Then he said he understood, and Willard looked at him for a moment with something I can only describe as the look of a man who has been carrying a thing alone for a long time and has finally found someone else's hands to put it in, and we all had supper together and did not speak of it again for several months. Thomas has honoured the silence his whole life. He is 54 years old now, and he has the same hands as his father, and he knows what this recorder contains, and I have his permission to make this record. The letters stopped in the spring of 1969. I have thought about the stopping for more than 50 years, and I have arrived at the same place every time I think about it, which is this. The stopping was not a sign that something had gone wrong. The stopping was a sign that something had settled. Gordon's letters, in those last 2 years, had a different quality than the early ones. Not worse, not sadder. They had become quieter, more settled. The accounting of seasons and conditions continued. The observations were as precise as ever, but the undertone of the letters had changed, in a way that I can only describe by saying that the early letters read like dispatches from a man still, orienting himself in a new country, and the late letters read like letters from a man who had found his footing. The last letter ended the same way all the others ended, your G. But there was a sentence before the close that I have held in my chest for more than 50 years, and that I am going to say now, because it is the thing Petra should know above everything else. He wrote, I have come to understand that being here is not an absence from my life, but a continuation of it in a direction I could not have charted. And I find that I am, in the way that counts most, exactly where I am supposed to be. I read that sentence in the spring of 1969, and I sat with it for a very long time. And then I did something I had not done since the summer of 1958. I went out to the shed where Gordon kept his carpentry tools, which I had not disturbed since the day he left, and I took out his hand plane and his block of beeswax, and I sat on the step of the shed in the late afternoon light, and I waxed the plane the way he had shown me once, drawing the sole across the block in the slow strokes he had demonstrated. And I did this for about half an hour, and when I was done, I put the plane back in its place on the shelf, and I went inside and made supper, and that was the closest I ever came to the feeling people describe when they say that they have made their peace with something. I want to say a few things about the letters themselves, because they are evidence, and I want them received as evidence. 22 letters over 11 years, twice per year, delivered to the mailbox at the end of this lane, with no stamp and no postmark and no indication of a carrier or a route. Each one in Gordon's hand, each one on paper consistent with the field journals he used for survey work. Pale yellow, slightly rough, the weight of government-issue stationery. In 4 of the letters, he referred to specific events in the valley that I was later able to confirm through Willard's independent knowledge. Events Willard had observed or inferred from Saint-Saëns during his own seasons in the upper drainage. Events that neither Willard nor I had discussed with each other before Gordon named them in the letters. The letter of October 1963 described in precise terms a change in the upper drainage that Willard had also observed that same autumn from the opposite side of the range, a change that had nothing to do with weather or season, and that neither of us could account for independently. I am not offering this as proof of anything. I am offering it as a data point from 2 independent observers, which is what a data point is. The Lands Branch file on Gordon Vance was closed in 1960. The death certificate is filed with the provincial registry for the purposes of every official record that exists. Gordon Vance died in the Kootenays range in the summer of 1958, cause undetermined. I signed documents affirming this because I was the surviving spouse, and the documents required a signature, and I signed them without believing a word they said. And I would sign them again tomorrow without believing a word, because the documents were not lies I told but conventions I tolerated. And the difference between those 2 things is one I have never had any difficulty keeping straight. Thomas asked me once, in the late 70s, whether I had been lonely. I thought about the question for a long time before I answered, because Thomas deserved an honest answer. What I finally said was this: I was lonely in the way that people are lonely when the person they love is far away and they cannot reach them, not in the way people are lonely when the person they love is gone. Those are 2 different kinds of lonely, and only one of them is a wound. I missed Gordon every day from the 14th of June, 1958, to the morning of his official death, which is to say, I missed him for as long as I have been alive in the years since, and I expect to miss him for however long I have left. But I knew he was in the world. I knew the world he was in was a good world, not a frightening one. Willard knew it too, and that was why, in the winter of 1974, when we made our promise to each other about carrying this until neither of us remained to carry it, we did not make the promise out of shame or out of fear, but out of a kind of protective love for a thing that did not need protecting by the Provincial Lands Branch or the Coroner's Office or anyone else with a stamp and a ledger. The thing protected itself, as it had always done, simply by being what it was, which was large and quiet, and beyond the reach of anyone who came looking with the wrong kind of attention. I said earlier that Gordon was not a man given to imagination, and I want to return to that because it is the key to everything. In the letter of October 1965, which arrived as the leaves were coming off the cottonwoods along the lane, he described a morning in the valley when he had been working, and he was always working, cataloguing, measuring, recording. It was how he was made, and he had looked up from what he was doing and one of the others was standing at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 20 feet from him, and it was looking at him. And he had looked back, and they had stood like that for a long time, he said. He had looked at the others many times by then, 7 years into his time in the valley. He was not frightened. He had not been frightened for a long time. Whatever he had felt in those first days, which he never described in detail, and which I did not ask him to. He wrote that he stood looking at this one for what he estimated, by the light, was somewhere around 15 minutes, and then the other turned and moved back through the timber, unhurried. And Gordon turned back to his work, he wrote. I have tried to find the word for what I felt in those 15 minutes, and the closest I can come is the word recognized, though I am aware that a surveyor is not supposed to use that word about a thing he cannot measure. I have thought about that sentence for more than 50 years. I know exactly what he meant by it. I cannot explain what he meant. I do not think it requires explanation. Gus Henriksen came into my life in 1972. I want to account for him properly because he was a good man and he deserves the accounting. He was a veterinarian with a practice in Creston, and he had lost his wife to illness too, years before we met, and he was a quiet, large, careful man who understood, from our second conversation, that I was not a widow in the ordinary sense of the word, and who chose, with full understanding, to come into the life I was actually living, rather than the one that appeared on the official records. I told him the truth in the second year of our marriage. I sat him at this table, and I told him. He listened for a long time. He asked 3 or 4 questions, which were practical questions about the terrain and the timeline and the condition of the letters, not the flustered questions that a different kind of man would have asked. When I was done, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, in the way that a man who has spent his life with animals sometimes says things, that there is more in the natural world than we have yet had the honesty to look at directly, and that Gordon Vance sounded like a man who had done what any good scientist does, which is observe without flinching and record, without embellishing. Gus never went looking. He never tried to find the valley or the passage in the rock or any of the things Gordon had described. He simply acknowledged what I knew and then held it with me, and that is a form of love I did not know existed before he demonstrated it. Thomas brought his daughter Petra to this house when Petra was 4 years old, and Petra has been coming ever since, every summer, every Christmas, and she has grown into a young woman of 23 who has her grandfather's precision and her grandmother's stubbornness, and those are not bad things to have. She has asked me twice about the stories, because the valley has its own long memory, and there are old people in it who remember Gordon's disappearance, and who have, over the years, said things to each other that have found their way to Petra's ears. I have told her, both times, that I would tell her when the time was right, and I said this recorder was the telling, and the time is now. Petra, what I want you to know is this. Your grandfather was not lost. He was found by something that found him in the most honest way one thing can find another, which is by seeing exactly what he was and choosing to remain near it. The valley he described in those letters was not a place of harm. It was a place of great age and great stillness, and a kind of order that has nothing to do with the order of the lands branch or the provincial registry or any document ever stamped and filed in this province. He was a surveyor, and what he found in the end was a country that exceeded all of his previous measurements, and he spent 11 years, taking careful note of it, which is what he would have done with any country he was given the chance to know. I do not know what the others are. Your grandfather did not know what they are. Willard Foss did not know what they are, and he observed them for 40 years. Not knowing is not the same as not understanding. I understand what they meant to your grandfather, which is the only understanding that ever mattered. They meant that he was not alone in that valley. They meant that something of great patience and great intelligence had chosen to share its country with him, and had done so without expectation of anything in return, except his continued, careful, unhurried attention, and that your grandfather, who was a man built entirely for careful and unhurried attention, had given them exactly that, every day, for 11 years, and perhaps beyond. The letters stopped. I do not know what that means in the literal sense. I do not know if Gordon is still alive in the body, or whether he has gone in the way all bodies go, somewhere in the high country, in a season I cannot name, in a place that will not be marked on any provincial map. I have thought about this for more than 50 years, and I am at peace with not knowing it, which is not the same as not caring about it. I care about it the way I care about everything I loved and lost and could not hold, steadily, without drama, with the knowledge that the caring is real, regardless of whether I can verify the object of it. What I can verify is the letters. 22 of them, in the tin in the high cupboard, in Gordon's hand, on pale yellow paper, spanning 11 years of seasons in the upper goat drainage. What I can verify is Willard Foss, who went to his grave with half of the truth I am now carrying alone, and who kept his silence as faithfully as any man I have ever known. What I can verify is my own observations, which are the observations of a registered nurse of 34 years, who knows the difference between evidence and wish. What I can verify is that Thomas Vance, who is 54 years old and has his father's eyes, believes every word of this account, because he is his father's son, and because he knows, as I know, that Gordon Vance was not a man who embroidered. I am going to stop the recording now. The kitchen is dark, and I am going to light the lamp on the table, which was Gordon's lamp, an old brass oil lamp that he kept on the table when he did his field paperwork in the evenings, and I am going to sit with it for a while before I go to bed. The mountains are there, beyond the window, the way they are always there, dark against the darker sky, and the upper drainage is somewhere in them, behind the second wall of the range. And I have never gone looking, because Gordon told me not to, and because Willard told me not to, and because in the quiet country of my own good sense I understood that some places remain themselves only so long, as they is not sought by people carrying the wrong kind of attention. I have not carried the wrong kind of attention. I have carried what Gordon sent me, folded into pale yellow paper, twice a year, for 11 years, and I have held it carefully, and I am setting it down now, here, in this kitchen, in the light of the same lamp, for Petra, for Thomas, for whoever finds this recorder in whatever drawer or box or tin it ends up in, after I am no longer here to keep it company. The world is more full than the records say. Your grandfather knew it. The mountains know it. I have known it for 60 years, and I am glad, with every part of myself that is still capable of gladness, that I was the one who got the letters.